I think you were also working at the Penn State Center for Mergers and Acquisitions, right? Can you talk more about how like these kind of acquisitions happen? Polygon acquired ton of like amazing ZK companies, right? If you were to explain to a newbie to the space, how does a merger or acquisition happen in these situations?
Yeah.
Giving like Polygon's example so that it's easier for everyone to understand what is like the flow chart or the process in these scenarios.
Yeah. So I think I'll keep it to like the basic
Yeah,
merger,
yeah,
not like the crypto mergers that we talk about sometimes, like token for token exchange. That's
yeah,
like complex, but like
yeah.
your
If you were to
typical
explain using Polygon's example, how those mergers would have taken place.
Yeah, so basically you've got two companies that are talking to each other. Oftentimes they're working together in one way or another. They have some sort of relationship and they basically say, you know what, there's some kind of like synergies here that
Mm-hmm.
that like make sense, right? So like in Polygon's case, you look at like the Hermez or Zero team and you say, okay, we've got like two good sets of like technical teams here.
Right.
Maybe there's some like overlapping like business thing, but like ultimately Polygon looks at it and says, but they've got something that we don't have, right? And it's this ZK kind of
Mm-hmm.
expertise.
Right.
We think that the future is going to be kind of zero knowledge technology. So there's actually something here. And so, right, so then you start like digging in, you start having like more in-depth conversations, start saying like, hey, would you be interested in working more closely together? And eventually you get to this conversation of like, why don't you actually just come entirely work with us, right?
Right.
And that's where you say, okay, that sounds good on the other side of that. And what does that look like, right? And so that's when you start talking about like cultural dynamics, like teams, who would work where, founders, are they co-founders, are they none of those things?
Yeah.
What are the economics going to look like?
Right.
And then eventually you reach like some decent place on that and you get the lawyers to draft up a term sheet.
Mm-hmm.
They send over a term sheet, gets negotiated, hopefully things go well, and then you say, okay, cool, we're on the same page.
Right.
Now let's go sign up like long form documents, negotiate those. Inherently in the middle of that negotiation, there's like always one thing that happens, which is some massive battle.
Right.
Where there's just some issue that somebody wants. And half the time, maybe not half the time, a quarter of the time, the deal falls apart at that point.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't reach. But to me, that's like the real test, right? Because at that point, you're like, okay, what's our relationship going to be like here?
Mm-hmm.
How do people react in those situations? I think is like super telling, right? As to like how strong a relationship is going to be. How do they act with like when there's some kind of adversity? So those kind of things I think are really telling at that point. But eventually, what ends up happening is somebody gives, because you've been in like negotiations for like months.
Right.
You're very committed to it.
Right.
And usually it's the one who's being acquired who's like, okay, I'll give on this. Because frankly, they're like, oh, I've got money at the end of this.
Right.
I want it. I can already see it.
Right.
And they like let that issue go, whatever it ends up being. It's like, it's so typical.
Right.
And then eventually you sign the docs
Uh-huh.
and teams start integrating
Right.
and figure out how to like best work together, right? In Polygon's case, what we did very intentionally was like the Hermez team that got acquired and then the Zero team, we kept them like very separate teams from Polygon, allowing to like operate very much like on their own, continue to develop in their way, and then like slowly ended up kind of like integrating them in a more meaningful way into Polygon when like teams were ready to do that, when we understood like exact dynamics, where it is that there was kind of like that synergy that could come together naturally, so that now we work kind of more kind of fluidly together than ever before.
I feel like once all the formalities are done and when the merger or the acquisition is completed and when you start working together, that's when the actual battle begins, right? Because now there are like literally a new set of people with probably a different mindset from a different background. And now how do you mix that culture? How do you like get comfortable with everyone, right? How were those things like for Polygon? How did you tackle those issues?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that was important was keeping them separate for a while. Like there's two different ways you can do that, right? Like one way you would like immediately bring them in.
Right.
But like you have to recognize the cultures were very different, right? You've got like the Hermez, which is like a Spanish-based team that has like one set of cultures. You got the Polygon Zero team that was like another set of cultures, and then you got like broader Polygon, right? So you keep them separate, let them work independently, and then start like introducing them, right, a little bit closer to Polygon. So it's like you introduce the people, right? So you start getting some product people to start interacting. they get to know each other, they like
Right.
each other, you bring them in like a little bit closer,
Right.
and then you start doing some more like other, like more like, let's call them like legal process things. You start introducing them to some of your processes. Like maybe you originally like left them on Discord because that's what they were doing, and you're like, hey, why don't you come into like our Slack channels?
Right.
They were naturally already starting to do that as they like interacted with people.
Right.
And so to me, like the forced, like, hey, you're going to start doing all of this now, I don't think it's like really like a good idea. I think ultimately like slowly bringing them in is the way to do it. And the biggest thing really comes down to like the founders, right? So like in all of these companies, everyone looks up to the founders and they want to be like, hey, are you guys like, how are you guys feeling about this? What are you doing? And ultimately, it's like what the founders do, right? If the founders say, hey, we want to keep operating independently, then that's frankly what's going to happen. When the founders do a good job of being like, hey, no, we're fully aligned, like, let's come work together, what you see is that that integration happens like a lot more naturally and a lot more easily, which has been like very nice to see. So.
Got it.